All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We might just get started now. My name is Craig Stanley, and I'm the National Business Development Manager with CHU. And I'd like to thank you for your attendance today. And I think whether you're a strata manager or an insurance broker, I hope and I think you'll get a lot of learning today about electric vehicles and the challenges of charging electric vehicles. Now, this information, of course, is important as EVs are the future of sustainable transport. And given the targets that we have in Australia in respect of net zero emissions by 2050, and that 100% of car sales will be electric vehicles by the 2040, and in some states will actually be earlier than that, strata communities, they do need to be thinking about preparing their buildings for this, as it will not be going away. It'll, of course, only be speeding up. Now, Josh, could you just change the slide? Move to the next slide. Now, today I'm coming to you from Brisbane, which is the traditional name is Meanjin. And our special guest today is Joshua Baldwin. He's from the SCA and he's coming to you from Adelaide, and the traditional name is Ghana. And in the spirit of reconciliation, the SCA and CHU acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia, and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, as part of the webinar series, we are thrilled to be partnering with the Strata Community Association, and we have a special guest to discuss electric vehicles and charging challenges. Now, our guest is Joshua Baldwin. Josh has an exceptional bio, and he's the Principal and Executive Director at Munro Property Group in South Australia. Now, he's quite busy. He's the Vice President of the SCA Australasia. He's also the President of the SCA South Australia and Northern Territory, and he's the Chair of the SCA Charging Task Force. So Josh will actually refer to a number of papers in the presentation that he's been heavily involved in, and he, of course, has a keen interest in electric vehicles, in fact, even owning one. He's a keen interest in sustainability and strata in general. He's been in the industry since 2011, and there isn't any type of title that he hasn't actually managed. Now, when you talk with Josh, you actually walk away certainly learning a lot more about the subject. So Josh, we're thrilled to have you as guest speaker representing the SCA today. So I'd now like to pass over to you, Joshua.
Thanks, Craig, and thank you to CHU as a whole for having me. I know that we do value the partnership as well nationally and throughout our states, and the fantastic work that CHU continue to contribute to the industry for the betterment of all. Well, good morning, brokers and managers. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to do my best to condense a whole lot of information into a short amount of time, and information that's relevant to you all as well. So electric vehicles, EVs as we'll probably refer to them throughout today, have emerged as a promising solution to a pressing need to combat climate change and reduce carbon emissions on a global scale. The commercial viability of passenger EVs has accelerated in the recent years, and as such, both in Australia and New Zealand have seen an exceptional growth in both the demand and ownership. Australia currently has approximately 83,000 EVs on the road. That's in 2023, and we're waiting for the new numbers, but I expect that to grow because last year we obviously had 44,000 in 2022. And so I'm predicting, or SCA is predicting, over 100,000 EVs, and I'm sure you can probably see them more and more on the road as is, because the production has actually increased by 86% globally over the last year, and sales globally are raised by about 35%. In Australia alone, we know that 1 in 5 people live in a form of a strata titled property, with the estimates of that number of people living in Strata will be reaching beyond 6 million people. And in New Zealand, while the proportion of people living in Strata is lower than Australia, thousands of vehicles will enter Strata complexes each year moving forward. And when we consider the rapid uptake of EVs into the wider vehicle fleets, the SCA believes it is become now imperative to consider the challenges associated with the integrating EVs into Strata communities. Strata communities really present an incredible opportunity for society as a whole to reach the goals of an electrified and greener future, and for individuals to have access to technology and choice in the marketplace. You see, the Strata communities are an economy of scale, where their sound collective decision-making can affect dozens and hundreds of people in their community, all simultaneously. And as the number of people choosing to live in Strata communities, such as apartments and townhouses, increase, they're served because they're served well by proximity to transport, shops, workplaces, rec centres, etc. continues. We need to ensure that we're also ready to serve as a choice to electrify their vehicles. Common facilities, which you all ensure, limited spaces, ageing infrastructure, and then the diverse shared ownership structures in a strata can create unique hurdles for EV ownership that aren't commonly faced in just a standalone home, such as a Torrens title here in South Australia. So what we did, by understanding the challenges to owners, tenants, managers, governments, infrastructure providers, we're better able to identify some key strategies in the infancy stage, as Craig has said, to solutions that can mitigate these impediments and promote the adoption of EVs within strata schemes. The integration of EVs into strata buildings has the potential to play a crucial role in the progression towards achieving sustainable development goals set by the public and private sectors, and identifying and issuing and addressing these obstacles within the face of strata communities. We can look at improving that for the betterment. So SCA devised last year a plan, a task force led by a national body, and just want to identify Alicia Fisher, CEO, Sean and Patrick, our advocacy team, and the work that they did to create CEVIT, and we'll talk about what we did in terms of that shortly. So just some key numbers here, which I just spoke about. I think everyone can say every day you end up seeing one or more EV on the road. I mean, you've got Mitsubishi, who've just released their EV Outlander with Russell Coit, which is a very interesting ad in terms of the snake being the charging cable and things like that. So you can see that every manufacturer is really stepping into the EV space. These are just some very basic graphs. As you can see, they will need to be updated this year, but you can just see that exceptional growth. Of course, Tesla, not playing favourites, but Tesla in their Model 3 and their Model Y, now that it's in full production, those numbers are just going to explode. As you can see, it's far outweighing kind of the BWDs and Polesters and Konas and stuff, which we'll talk about shortly. But there is a big move for electrical infrastructure to become cohesive, I mean, amongst ecosystems, I guess you could say, comparing, I guess, you know, the Apple iPhone lightning cable to the USB-C and all that sort of stuff. And as this progresses, it's things like that we need to consider. So last year, CEVIT was formed, and CEVIT stands for the Strata Electric Vehicles Infrastructure Task Force by SCA. That was chaired by myself. We had a few other strata managers on that task force, as well as some industry experts in terms of electrical engineers, providers for charging solutions, etc. We had 4 main goals: identify the major challenges facing EVs uptake, provide a short report detailing the state of play, provide input and guidance as to a response to the federal government's upcoming consultation, which I'll talk about next, and then expand on that report with a challenges report. And that one has had some great legs on it and had some fantastic uptake as well. So we completed all those goals, and we are currently restructuring our task force with some new terms of reference because it's not going away. It's currently evolving, and so we'll continue to provide advocacy on that as well. So the first thing we did was submit a consultation paper to the National Electric Vehicle Strategy Consultation Team. And we made some key recommendations for government, 7 in total, and they are on the screen as well. I guess we were extremely surprised when the report recommendations came back that in fact they had actually listened. We were very worried about the fact that it would just be about getting EVs onto the ground in Australia and very much the sale of EVs, which is obviously being incentivised by the federal government and the state governments alike, which we'll talk about shortly. But we need to put them somewhere. We need to charge them somewhere. And if you look at the data, over 50% of Australia's strata is older than the year 2000. And that presents a huge unique challenge, in fact, that there's a lot of retrofitting and almost all of these buildings have not been set up and designed to take the infrastructure of EVs. So retrofitting is going to be a huge issue. So on the report, federal government listened and included important provisions for multi-unit developments in its strategy as a result of the SCA advocacy. And as you can see here, and I've bolded it, enable EV uptake for residents of existing multi-residential buildings is a key priority of EVs by the federal government. And we couldn't say thank you enough for bringing light to that. You're all over Australia. Every state is at its certain phase of adopting EVs as well. So what we did in the phase 1 report, which I'll go through now, is we did a little scorecard for each state. Our report was called the State of Play. And as you can see, you can pick up your state there, but I'll quickly run through kind of the strategies of each capital city. So the ACT, their emissions reduction strategy, they've already achieved 100% renewable electricity. Now their focus has shifted to transportation, and the ACT is a zero emissions vehicle strategy 22 to 30, aiming to decarbonise all of the major sectors. And of course, the ACT government in itself identified that older residential buildings are not designed to support EV charging, and that's just due to their outdated electrical infrastructure. And so as a part of their zero emissions vehicle strategy, I guess it shows a testament to a commitment to promoting EVs, and there are certain financial and infrastructural commitments coming as well. New South Wales is committed to a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, and they look to achieve net zero by 2050. And they also have a multifaceted approach to transform the state's road and transport network. And they have acknowledged the challenges of retrofitting EV charging infrastructure. And they are aiming for more than 50% of passenger vehicle sales to be EVs by 2030, as well as they push towards electrification. Northern Territory, they've got a net zero emissions target of 2050, obviously a little bit of a smaller market there. Their plan is called the Electric Vehicle Strategy Implementation Plan of 2021 to 26. It was introduced focusing on vehicle costs, knowledge enhancement and charging infrastructure. Interestingly, whilst the government didn't really recognise retrofitting, believe it or not, the Northern Territory are more scared of range anxiety, which makes sense, being a very large land. And if you tune in to or look up on YouTube, the 7:30 report, ABC did a article on a gentleman who owns the the Tandy store, the electronics store in Alice Springs, and he is trying to electrify the desert. And there is a very interesting solution to that. Whilst it's a bit anecdotal, but there's a guy in the middle of the Northern Territory, his name's Spud. He's got an EV charger. Unfortunately, it's powered by a diesel generator. So as you can see, it's a bit counterproductive. But obviously the NT is looking at that sort of stuff as well. So feel free to have a look at that and have a bit of a giggle as well. Queensland's emissions reduction strategy is net zero by 2050 and aims for a 30% reduction by 2030. And the state has obviously emphasised the importance of planning implementation, and with the zero emission vehicle strategy 2022 to 23 is a testament to their commitment to EVs as well. South Australia, we've got a target of 50% reductions by 2030, net zero by 2050. Government is keen on ensuring that the future planning considers the requirement for adequate EV charging infrastructure, and has recently engaged with the RAA, the motoring company here, members company here in South Australia, and they are rolling out significant DC charging throughout the state as well. The EV action plan and goals for new passenger vehicles to be electric by 2035 for all new sales showcases SA's commitment to EVs. Tasmania has proposed new emissions reductions target of net zero by 2030. And the government has committed $6.78 million in funding to EVs and introduced programs like EV grid trials and Charge Smart grants as well. Victoria, at the time of the report, had their zero emissions vehicle roadmap introduced with a $100 million commitment, and the government is aiming for 50% of car sales by 2030 and 100% by 2040. And obviously that $100 million commitment indicates Victoria's strong push towards promoting EVs. Western Australia, the State Electric Vehicle Strategy for Western Australia was introduced as a commitment net zero by 2050. And they showcase in that report commitment as well, and looking at financial infrastructural details to be provided shortly. So as you can see, there is a huge amount of difference between each of the states, and each state has its own pluses and minuses to kind of what they're doing. But at the end of the day, it comes back to electricity doesn't discriminate state to state. And so it'll be the same problems each state will face, and will continue to push at a state level and at a federal level for further assistance as well. So off the back of the phase one, state of play report, we moved to looking at the challenges, which everybody was immediately interested in. And that report came out earlier, only a few months ago now. And so this was an industry first report. It was a comprehensive analysis of the specific issues that the mass integration of EVs play into strata buildings, and what that will create throughout Australia and New Zealand. So as I said, approximately 6 million strata residents across Australia and New Zealand, and the electrical vehicle sales looking at increasing by 35%. We needed to identify what we thought are critical issues and unique challenges that are faced when you're trying to integrate that into strata. And so I'll break down the report, and I'll give a quick summary on each of those, and then I'll get more into the safety aspect and kind of, people thinking that we're driving down the road in an EV and it's going to spontaneously combust. It doesn't. There's reasons for that, and I just want to bust some myths like Mythbusters do. So EV charging infrastructure costs and strata governance. I know a lot of the strata managers on this call will know exactly why that can be challenging, but it's important to have residential charging. Having access to an EV charger at a resident is vital for EV ownership, because it offers that convenience, accessibility and reliability that a public EV just can't match. A public EV charger can't match. You know, you go to these public EVs and sometimes you have to wait half an hour because people are parked there. Being able to charge overnight at home allows users to optimize cost effectiveness and then align their charging needs of their vehicle with their daily schedules. The National Construction Code, the NCC, was amended in Australia, and that now mandates that all Class 2 buildings, so apartment blocks, buildings with 2 or more sole occupancy units, that are constructed after October 23 should now accommodate EV charging. New Zealand, we're waiting on them to have such a requirement as well. In terms of strata governance, and this is for the brokers out there, unfortunately, it's not as easy as just getting approval and a tick to move on. They can be quite complicated. Owners corporations, they operate in a democratic system, and I'm sure you understand that when you're tendering quotes and things like that, where each member can vote on issues, including the installation of EV charging infrastructure. The type of resolution changes from state to state, which makes it more difficult. In South Australia, it requires a special resolution. And so what that means is no more than 25% of people can vote against it because it is changing the outward exposure of the property. But in the ACT, it only requires a majority, which is 50%. In the strata sector in Australia and New Zealand, there's a lot of private investment, as you're aware, and it's also an affordable entry point into the surging real estate market as it stands. The University of New South Wales City Future 2020 Strata Insights report, there is a new one, but this is the 2021, shows that more apartments are rented than are owner occupied. So those are rented 47%, owned outright 12%, owned with a mortgage 16%, and there are unoccupied units of 17% and other 8%. And so as a result, there's a substantial amount of private investment into the sector. And often those people that are living in strata complexes are not necessarily the owners of the lots themselves. And so, of course, this creates friction when considering the implementation of EVs and specifically electric vehicle charging. So tenants with rent, given a strata scheme, will likely be more motivated to install an EV infrastructure for themselves, whilst owners of the lot may not be, because it doesn't affect that. And so this may manifest through other owners of lots who do not reside in the scheme being more likely to vote against the installation of EV charging infrastructure. And they're likely, as they would likely incur the extra associated costs with retrofitting without gaining any utility of the installation. And in terms of as they grow in popularity, the capital appreciation of strata lots with access to EV charging also needs to be considered when factoring the changes of the National Construction Code to buildings that do not have access to EV charging facilities will likely be a disadvantage to them in the future. And so as myself, I'm an agent, and we also have a property management role, and we will see that people with EVs will be looking for properties to rent that have EV chargers. So right at the moment, we're at this tipping point where financially ROI for an investor isn't there, but potentially in the future it will be there and will be required to be there as well. In terms of cost, everyone says, well, how much is it going to cost me to install an EV charger? Again, I will put a disclaimer out there now. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not an installer. Whilst I've sat around in many meetings listening to these experts, it is building specific, and we'll get to why it's building specific shortly. But approximately, as a case study, 100 apartments raised $200,000 to install the backbone, and then so $2,000 each. Let's use whole numbers there as a special levy, and then each individual lot owner at their own cost and their own space could install an EV charger, dependent on obviously if they wanted that for their particular car park, and they range from $2,500 to $4,500. So, approximate figures are $6,000 to be connected, $6,500 to be connected and plugged in. to such a backbone. And so talking about the backbone and the infrastructure and technical considerations, understanding the technical aspects and grasping the facets of EV electrical infrastructure is pretty critical. As again, the Strata managers would know, a lot of the people that sit around the table at committee meetings are not electrical engineers, and as a Strata manager, you're not an electrical engineer, and so having the right people there at the right time to give advice on identifying where upgrades are required and what those essential costs are. The backbone refers to a foundational of infrastructure elements that support EV charging, and these components ensure an integrated and optimized system and allow for the charging management, energy usage monitoring, billing coordination, and whilst that part of the installation can be costly, and especially for retrofitting existing buildings, it's probably the most effective method for providing all owners and residents with equal charging access. What really needs to happen is you need to understand where the building's EV ready. And so, some recommendations would be undertake a resident survey, conduct, a survey of the residents to identify if what their attitudes are. Are they looking at getting EVs? Is it a priority for them? Get an energy assessment, engage an energy auditor to obtain a building energy assessment. And that'll look at historical peak energy supplies and loads, and then availability. And then charger installations. So collaborate with a chosen supplier, a recommended supplier to install that infrastructure. And there are a lot of EV charging options available. And these can be things such as 2.2 kilowatt chargers to 22 kilowatt three-phase chargers. And you need electricity meters to be compliant with obviously monitoring that as well. There's a big thing about I need energy in my car straight away, and I think that comes from a point where you can go to the Bowser, fill up your car with petrol, and instantaneously you've been given that range. At the end of the day, I'm not driving my car during the evening. When I'm sleeping, my car is charging. That's usually when the cheapest electricity is. When you look at preparing a building, and I'll talk about this shortly, there is a lot of embedded networks as well. There are a lot of buildings who are becoming really smart with how they use their electricity. Right now, I'll use my house as an example. I have my EV plugged in, and I have a little computer that looks at my solar array. When my solar is generating power, it's putting power into my EV. When it's not generating, it puts it, it just doesn't put the power into when it's excess. So if I've got a washing load on and the dishwasher on and my house is using more power, it will just drop my EV. Now I can quickly flick that switch and go, I need power now. But there are more and more people out there who are interested in, either the green side of it or hacking the system. I've done 25,000 kilometers in my Tesla, and I was doing the sums before. I've paid $27 for those kilometers based on my charging habits. And there will be more and more people like me who don't just live in a house, who live in a strata, who will probably try and want to do that as well. And that opens up a whole different ball game as well. So I do encourage you to have a look at that phase 2 challenges report. There are some key takeaways on your screen now, but I really want to move into the insurance and the safety as well, in terms of kind of what that looks like as well. So this is some comments. Evidence suggests that electric vehicles are not necessarily more likely than a conventional ICE. An ICE is an internal combustion engine vehicle to be involved in a fire incident. For example, it's reported that in London, EV fires account for 1 in 40 of all car fires, according to Professor David Howard of RMIT. He quotes that these vehicles, EVs, are no more likely to be involved in fires than a conventional vehicle. But when they are involved in fires, the fire management is at a different risks. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about now in terms of insurance and safety and things like that. So what I want to talk about is the one that you'll hear. It's called thermal runaway. Thermal runaway refers to a self-sustaining, uncontrolled exothermic, which means heat-producing, reaction within a battery cell. And once it's initiated, this reaction can cause the temperature of the cell to rise rapidly, leading to the release of a significant amount of energy in a short period of time. That can result in these battery cells bursting, catching fire, or exploding. And so in terms of the change in firefighting standards, I'll talk about that shortly, but how does it happen in an EV battery? There's been a lot of technology and a lot of old news. You'll note that many years ago, Hyundai recalled a whole lot of Konas due to insufficient batteries. The technology has increased significantly. Since then, it is much safer. There are certainly requirements and mitigation methods that manufacturers and we can do. So because they typically use a lithium-ion battery, they've got a high energy density. Therefore, under certain circumstances, they can be prone to thermal runaway. So one is like overcharging, and you'll see in, I'm sure you've seen on phones that expand. That's a thermal runaway from overcharging. A battery cell is beyond its point of its design limit, and it can lead to an excessive heat generation and then cause the electrolyte in the battery to break down, releasing the gas as well. You can have an external short circuit. So if a positive and negative terminal accidentally are connected, this can lead to a rapid discharge of energy, thus producing the heat and thermal runaway. You can have an internal short circuit, which is caused by, could be a manufacturing defect, or if the battery is punctured in some way. And these can obviously lead to localized heating and trigger thermal runaway. High temperature, so if the battery is exposed to excessively high temperature in the ambience, it can create an increased risk of thermal runaway. And physical damage, of course, such as a car crash can damage the actual cells, which can lead to internal short circuits in themselves as well. So why is that a concern? Well, as you can see on this slide here, it's safety. Thermal runaway can lead to explosions and bits and pieces like that. The battery performance, if it doesn't lead to a catastrophic event, can certainly downgrade the performance and the lifespan of the battery as well. So there are certainly mitigation methods used for this type, and they have been quickly expanded, such as a battery management system, BMS. So all modern EVs are now equipped with a BMS that can monitor and manage the battery state of charge and temperature and health, etc. Thermal management, so cooling systems of the batteries to maintain them within a safe range. Separators, most batteries are now designed with separators between the cells, which is a simple way to prevent thermal runaway. They've got a better battery chemistry as well to develop these new chemistries that are much more less prone to thermal runaway, should I say. And the rugged design of these EVs is incredible, and they're designed to withstand a huge amount of impact and crumbling. And the position in which the batteries are placed for most vehicles is in the undercarriage, away from the front and the back end. And so whilst it's a concern for EVs, there certainly is a huge advancement in technology and safety being continually developed. And in turn, if it does happen and there is a thermal runaway, there are obviously strategies to combat that type of fire. And I'll just touch on the one it takes a huge amount of water. It does. In a standard vehicle fire, and I will put my hat on that I used to be in the country fire service here in South Australia, particularly in the Burnside Brigade, which is a metropolitan brigade. And we did discuss this early on as well, and it does usually take about 1,400 to 1,500 litres of water to extinguish a normal iced fire. but it can take up to 30,000 litres to extinguish a EV fire. And now if I take you back to Year 7 science and the fire triangle, and what you're required to have, fuel, we need to eliminate the heat, we need to eliminate the oxygen by smothering the fire. So therefore, that's what 30,000 litres of water can do. Now, obviously, putting 30,000 litres of water on top of a vehicle when the battery is underneath, I can all hear you saying, seems to be pretty counterproductive, Josh. And it is, because you need to get that water underneath the car to properly extinguish it. It's really hard to obviously submerge a vehicle in a tank of water when it's 3 stories down in a basement. For example, if a thermal runaway event is to occur. And I want to just identify the fact that thermal runaway, they don't, again, as I said, they don't just spontaneously ignite. There is usually something wrong with an external short circuit. And that is why we are saying it is imperative that you install good infrastructure. The car will protect as much as the car can do, but if you have a unlicensed contractor installing a third-hand EV charger because you're trying to save some dollars, they need to be compliant infrastructure. That is the most imperative. And we've seen many strata managers send me pictures of people dangling a extension cord from their 4th story balcony into their car park so that they can charge their EV car. I mean, they've put a plastic bag around the 2 extension point ends to protect that. But what about the stretch in the cable from the 4th story? And it's things like that that create a short circuit internally that runs into the battery as well. It's absolutely incredibly insane. And I can see all you brokers virtually just going, oh, how would I even deal with a claim like that? How can you deal with stupidity? So there is a huge amount of technological advancements, and I want to show you one by Rosenbauer. Rosenbauer is a fire engineering company in America, and they've devised a specific tool. Talking to Craig about this yesterday, I'm expecting a baby in the next month, and I recently sat through a child first aid course, and we were on about the defibrillator. And it occurred to me that when I was in the fire service, we were only just getting defibrillators on our trucks. And that was some 10 years after they've been designed. But once you get this equipment, the saving of lives becomes much more effective because you've got the tools. Unfortunately, there's a lack of speed to get the right tools onto these trucks because they have to be tested, they have to be produced, etc., etc. And so Rosenbauer's come up with a fantastic solution, and we will continue to push government, not just from the built environment section, but obviously from the fireys as well. So this is the Rosenbauer solution to extinguishing a fire under a vehicle. So I'll give you my affiliate Amazon code after that, and you can go out and purchase yourself a best system. No. So as you can see, there are significant advances in technology on both ends. Unfortunately, the risk comes and then the solution comes therefore after. And so these solutions are slowly being looked at in terms of buildings. And I was doing a little bit of research last week into that, and something very, very similar to that. Of course, you would see in buildings a fire infrastructure of a wet system over the top, sprinklers, and I'll talk about that in Quebec City shortly. But there are fire engineers out there looking at putting in specific EV charging parking bays asphalted sprinkler systems. And so if the vehicle gets too hot underneath, it's basically exactly the same. You're just taking it from the ceiling and putting it underneath, sprays water up and into that battery. And it's just about cooling that battery and extinguishing that fire from underneath that will cause the fire to be suppressed. So Quebec City, one of the only known EV fires in a strata. It was in 2022. It was a 4-level strata, 4 a.m. in the morning. This vehicle caught fire, had a thermal runaway event. It was plugged in and it was being charged. To the best of my knowledge, this wasn't a recalled Hyundai Kona. It was one of the newer models with the GE batteries, not the LG batteries. This vehicle was suppressed by a fire suppression system, but they couldn't get enough water on it. So they actually had to extricate the vehicle from the underground garage before they could do that. Obviously, that poses some risk with getting the vehicle out. Whether or not that is ACP that you see on that property there as well, another risk, but of course was able to be extinguished. Now they did say that the fire suppression system, the wet system in that garage, prevented further exposure to other parts of that property, so the cars either side. Whilst they may have a little bit of a black tinge to them, they certainly weren't involved in the fire and causing further damage. So they do catch on fire. It can happen, and most of the time it's not due to the fact that the car just spontaneously combusted as it was driving down the road. It's due to bad infrastructure installs, cables dangling from the 4th story, or vehicle impacts as well. So what does this mean for the industry? In terms of what we need and what we look at, we need to engage with fire safety consultants when you're obviously installing. You need to use those accredited practitioners. You need to use a company who knows what they're doing in terms of Strata. It's one thing installing a EV charger on a building, a standalone house, but it's something when you're actually tapping into a large amount of electrical infrastructure. We can mitigate risks. We can encourage owners to take extra care with the infrastructure. I was at a Strata last week and I saw that someone had just left the EV cable just on the ground, and you know that's prone to people driving over it, damaging the cables, and therefore causing other issues. Upskilling of not only brokers and strata managers, but other people in the industry to actually help them understand, and looking at those fire and emergency services training as well. And we encourage government as well to progress with that as well. I think it's imperative to have conversations, brokers with strata managers and strata managers with brokers. Strata managers, if you're looking at if the corporation, is looking at installing EV chargers, that's a conversation that you need to have with your brokers as well. And Craig will talk about that shortly as well in terms of the conversation. We want to ensure that the conversation is consistent and it's had at a high level. It's not a band-aid solution. We keep saying to industry, getting one charger in a building is great, and it will certainly look at mitigating people right now sending you emails. Well, I bought an EV, and those numbers are going up. The federal government is throwing money at people buying EVs. The FBT benefits that you can get for novate leasing an EV. South Australia gives you $3,000 if you buy an EV, and 3 years worth of registration paid for and things like that. This problem isn't going away. It's not going away fast, and it's coming faster, should I say. So having those constant conversations with, let's phase it. Let's look at phase 1, getting a charging solution for the immediate risk, and then what are we going to do for the next 5 years to prepare? And there's costs to that, right? So let alone the increase of your building sum insured, it should be considered as well. And so in terms of, next slide, the main risk factors that insurers may identify in shifts in strata insurance premiums could include primary hazard relating to electric vehicles, particularly in relation to outdated electrical wiring and inappropriate charging infrastructure. Electrical shock, there's high voltages that are required to charge electric vehicles. This could leave the consumer vulnerable to electrocution, especially in factoring potential for damage to cables. Theft, people will start stealing these chargers. If you look at a Tesla battery gateway charger, it's 4 screws, and when you pull it off, it disconnects from the circuit, and you can completely remove that. And so I'm sure they'll go walkabouts just as much as most other stuff goes walkabouts sometimes. Business interruptions. So what if these EV charging are mixed use and commercial residential strata schemes? They may have an effect on the supply of the electricity to a building, and may be a contributing factor to the increased risk of power outages. Personal injury, EV charging cables placed incorrectly without consideration, trips, falls, etc. like that, just as much as a raised bit of concrete. Liability, product, EV charging equipment is often manufactured and implemented by third parties as opposed to the vehicle manufacturer themselves. So charging stations need to be appropriately qualified, and the providers need to be qualified and identified. And maintenance, you have to maintain these things. You have to ensure that the cables are undamaged, etc. As well. So that is pretty much a summary from a strata manager's perspective and the SCA's perspective. And Craig, if he's still online, is here. He is. Is going to take it from here for all your premium worries and woes.
No worries. All right. We might actually, you can see that, about disclosing or not disclose. We might just go actually to the next slide. Okay. So basically, I just want to talk about our current position, really, and in respect of, really, we don't have CHU's question set. When applying for insurance, does not currently ask about EVs. So basically, the insured is not obliged to advise CHU if electric vehicles are present. Okay, so you don't actually need to advise. We don't ask about the number of charging stations or anything like that. But the thing is, like any type of defect or maintenance issue, of course, if there are any hazards that are present as a result of the EVs or something entirely different, such as overloaded switchboards or other known electrical hazards, to ensure maximum chance of having any claim paid, the insured should advise us of these material facts. So yeah, just like defects, just like cladding, things like that, you do need to disclose those things. So if there is overloaded switchboards or anything like that, if you're unsure, I think it's best to just, disclose to be safe. Now, of course, in respect to pricing, given that electric vehicles is in its infancy, and we have not yet caught up to, to factors in electric vehicles into pricing models. So we currently don't have the available data and the incidence of which to base the prices off. So, naturally with insurance pricing, we're always trying to anticipate the cost of future claims. And as such, it is possible that the integration of EVs in Strata may affect the premium, the cost of premiums in the future. All right. But at the moment, it's not factored into the pricing. In fact, pricing for electric vehicles, insurance itself is still in its inception. So the consequential loss to building insurance, like cladding back in the day, could be years away. So we don't know how far away that is. Okay, but Josh, could you turn the next slide? Okay, so basically CHU, we do have a fact sheet, and I also want to say that we do support SCA's position in respect to the contents of the reports that have been produced that Josh has been running through. Now, but I do want to bring your attention the fact sheet. It is on the website, and of course, this can be shared with insureds and addresses issues, that the strata communities should be considering. All right, so we must stress that it's extremely important that strata communities obtain advice, installation, and maintenance by suitably qualified professionals. Okay, so it does have guidance. I'm not actually going to we're running short of time, so I won't run through the details of that. But just make sure that, installation and maintenance is done by qualified professionals. And on that report also, I just want to, do a disclaimer. We're not electrical engineers, etc., and we don't give advice in particular circumstances. So it's really just guidance on what they should be asking for. Okay, we might go to the next slide. Thanks, Josh. Now, Josh was talking about these documents, so I've just put the website up there. So that you can go to the SCA website and you can actually take some of those reports. So the phase 1 state of play, phase 2 challenges, and the national electric vehicle strategy. Okay, so feel free to go on there and have a look. And thanks, Josh. Now, both the SCA and the CHU take sustainability seriously. And the SCA's vision, of course, is to unite the industry and raise their influence to create livable, green, efficient, and smart strata communities. Now, I want to draw you to the attention of, the SCA has, CHU, we basically in 2022, we took the step forward of becoming a signatory to the SCA Sustainability Certificate. Now, CHU, we've also got our Sustainable Charter, which sets out our commitment towards leading the way for a brighter, more sustainable future for our whole community. And this means that we'll produce a sustainable impact report yearly to show that we walk the talk, which will be transparent on our website. So if you want to know any more information in respect of what the SCA and the CHU are doing in respect to sustainability, please go to our respective websites. Now, Josh, we did intend to have questions, but I think we're well short of time. I think we've certainly covered off, you've certainly covered off a lot of food for thought, and we will go through those questions, and where we can, we'll go back to those individuals to be able to respond. But Josh, I especially would like to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to help educate our audience on electric vehicles and the challenges, which obviously you have a great passion for. We certainly learned a lot from your knowledge. So I think that was great. Thank you very much, Josh.
No, I appreciate that, Craig, and thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for listening. I think I will leave you with one thing. This is an ever-changing subject, and as you can see in the chat, every fire service is coming out with recommendations, every motoring club's coming out with recommendations, and as the technology curve just increases, those recommendations don't get squashed, but they get modified and modified and modified. So this is a continual conversation that needs to be had. So I encourage brokers to have those conversations with their strata managers and strata managers with their brokers as well. Absolutely. Thank you, Craig.
Thank you, Josh. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time to listen to us today. You'll receive a copy of the recording and your CPD certificates in approximately the next week, in another week. And we look forward to bringing you a new webinar in September. So please stay tuned and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.